Hey guys, Savage Joy here with Real Progressives. Tonight I am joined by, for the second night in a row, another Jacobin amazing independent journalist. Tonight we have Mr. Kurt Hackbarth. And I've been reading his articles. He's actually in Mexico, and he's been writing a lot about politics from that perspective. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Kurt.
Thanks so much for having me, Joy. Appreciate that.
Absolutely. Um, I've actually first reached out to you because I saw your Bernie video where we were all making those videos saying
Right.
why, our Bernie stories. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to reach out to him because I don't know. Sometimes I get intimidated by people. So I'm like, I'm going to
really
do
glad
it.
you did. Yeah.
I'm so glad I did. You've written for Jacobin, The Nation, and you're actually co-authoring a book right now about the 2018 Mexican election.
Yeah, we covered the election last year, which resulted in the election of Andrés Manuel López Obrador with an independent media project we set up called MEXELEX. So it's going to be based on our travels through the country last year.
That's awesome. And where can people find that?
Well, it'll be coming out in 2020. So when it's still kind of in process.
Awesome. So do you kind of want to explain, like, I mean, Amlo is initials, but for people who aren't familiar, do you want to kind of just give a broad explanation, and then we can kind of delve deeper into it?
Sure. So Mexico's new president is Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and it's from a party that he himself founded called Morena. So he's usually called Amlo for the kind of the acronym of his very long name. So AMLO has been a figure in Mexican politics for a generation. He's been a social activist for many years. He helped found the party, the PRD, which was founded in the wake of the 1988 electoral fraud, and then became, from there, vaulted into being the first left-wing mayor of Mexico City in the year 2000, and was a very popular center-left mayor. Ran for president for the first time in 2006, and the election was stolen by just a very nasty fraud. So he really won the election in 2006. But instead of just rolling over, instead of doing an Al Gore and rolling over, AMLO kept going and kept building his movement and ran again in 2012 and had it stolen again. Not necessarily this time through the polls, but through an entire operation of illegal dark money by the person who won, Enrique Peña Nieto, in 2012. And again, AMLO did not roll over. He ran again. And not only that, he formed his own party. He formed his own party after the 2012 election and won on a new party this last time in 2018, which is pretty amazing if you think about it from the American point of view, how difficult it is to break in with a new party in our system. So I think it's just an absolute example of total persistence on AMLO's part to run, suffer fraud, be in the streets, be protesting, and keep going until he could win by a margin that was uncheatable. He won by 30 points last year. So
what do you think he did differently this time that they actually let him win, lack of a better term?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In a sense, he moderated his message a little bit from his first campaign. But what he really did that was just very effective is that he learned from previous experiences. As he said after the 2006 election, he had worked to win the election, but he never thought he had to protect his victory at the polls and in the precincts. So he learned very well that you have to have precinct observers at every precinct. You have to have people there at every vote count. It's kind of like the way progressives in the U.S. who weren't up on things learned how the DNC rigs things. Just a lot of people just, kind of think, oh, well, primaries happen. People learn. And now strategies are different. And I think that's the big thing that Amlo learned. He put structure in place that that didn't allow that kind of stuff to be pulled again. And with his new party, the PRD, his former party, was kind of like the US Democrats. They were a very centrist party, and a lot of elements of that PRD were working against him. So he formed a new party, and the party was much more unified behind him in the run last year. Those are two big things he did differently.
Do you have any idea how many people are in the party he founded?
I don't have an exact number on party members, but I think what's important to note with Morena and with Mexico in general is that Mexico has public funding of elections, and that's what allowed Morena to get up and running so quickly. And America does not, has a very limited, you have to get to certain thresholds and all of this. Morena could not have gotten to where it did so quickly, even with a charismatic leader like AMLO, without public funding of elections. And that allowed it to do what it needed to do, to get on the ballot, all over the country, to be able to, you get your free airtime in Mexico, to be able to run your TV ads, to be able to run your radio ads, and to be able to build a party. And that process is still going on. Morena is still a very young party. And a big critique you can make of Morena is that it's borrowed candidates from other parties, what are called paracaidistas, people that parachute in from other parties, unfortunately, and use the Morena label to run. So Morena now has got a big job to make sure that actual progressives are running, because a lot of them in Congress, in the local Congresses, governorships, are not on the left. They just run into the Morena name, but they're recycled politicians going through the revolving door. Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like, Elizabeth Warren getting the progressive label.
Yeah. There's the political class in Mexico. So there's this long-standing tradition of hopping parties to whatever party will be convenient for you to run in. And so Morena has had some of that coming in. And we have to point out, which I think is really important, this is the first. It's a center left. AMLO is center left. He's certainly not a socialist. He's a mild social democrat. But even that, this is the first center left government in Mexico since the 1930s, since Lázaro Cárdenas, who was the president that nationalized Mexico's oil industry, which in that point was in the hands of American and English, interests, Shell Oil and all of them. So he took that big step of nationalizing Mexico's oil industry, risking foreign intervention. And that became the big lever for Mexican development over the course of the 20th century. There hasn't been really a left-wing government since, through fraud or through any other kind of means, international pressure. So this is, there are people on the left who've certainly gotten disillusioned with certain things that AMLO has done, but it's still a big deal, what's going on down here.
Absolutely. So what are some of the things he ran on that you think, people were really energized by?
Well, his big thing is ending corruption, which sounds like something that every politician says, but he really means it. Mexico, over the last several governments, Felipe Calderón and Enrique Peña Nieto, has become this absolute kleptocratic state. Basically, just using any means in the government to line their pockets, give contracts to friends, bleed the state dry. I mean, really, there's hardly any way to overstate that. And it's funny how, because Peña Nieto was on the US side, the American press never talked about, Peña Nieto's corruption. They did a little bit, right? But, if it were Venezuela, oh my God, this and that. But, they would talk about Mexico's violence, but they wouldn't talk about the fact that Mexico, with very tacit US support, had become this absolute kleptocracy. So AMLO came in on the promise to clean that up from top to bottom. And he's really started doing that. One of his first major acts as president was to go after gasoline theft. Mexico has a series of gasoline ducts throughout the country. and people were stealing gasoline out of those ducts. And it was an inside operation going on in the inside of Pemex with people in the field that said, "Oh, the gasoline is going down this way," and people would be, getting gasoline out of the ducts to the tune of about $2 billion a year worth of gasoline theft.
Oh my God.
A huge black market of gasoline theory. It's called huachicol in Mexico. And he went after that big time. That was his first big act, going after this inside-outside game of gasoline theft. And he took a big risk, for the first several weeks of his administration. There was no gas in some gas stations. Gas things were lining up. The right wing was saying, "Look, this is what happens when you have a left-wing government. You're going to have gas lines and shortages, and next thing you know, the supermarkets are going to be empty, and this is what happened." And it blew over because his strategy worked. It's not completely over, but he cut about 90% of that gasoline theft down.
Wow.
And in that same way, he's gone after this, what they call the pharaonic Mexican state of presidents who are earning more than the U.S. president, and judges who earn upward of the equivalent of $30,000 a month, in a country where the minimum wage is $5 a day. So there was this caste of Mexican politicians, Congress people, judges who were living high on the hog. They would take helicopters to go play golf. Peña Nieto had this huge Air Force One equivalent plane that he'd fly all over the world with, when 60 million Mexicans are in poverty, absolute poverty. And this just was a slap in the face and an offense to millions of people in the country. So AMLO said, "All right, we're selling that plane. We're selling off all these, these cars." I was up in Mexico City a few months ago, and I went past the presidential palace area. They're selling off all these unneeded extra cars, auctioning them off. No more helicopters to go places. We're cutting back this pharaonic state. AMLO flies coach, like Bernie. AMLO flies coach. No Mexican president would ever have gotten anywhere near coach class, ever. So he's got this real common touch. He has this real folksy appeal, and not this kind of bullshit George W. Bush fake folksy appeal, but a real folksy appeal with kind of these colorful expressions, and he's got really kind of the pulse of the people in that sense. And that's really helped him. He has a press conference every morning for an hour, up sometimes 2 hours a day. Every morning at 7 o'clock, he gives a press conference and said, "This is what we're doing. We're doing this." He'll bring in a cabinet member who will bring in someone else to explain what they're doing. So it's an openness to the public that Peña Nieto, I think, had 1 or 2 press conferences his entire. It's like Trump. Trump will refuse to have press conferences. Peña Nieto would refuse to have press conferences. He'd set up these kind of, cushy softball interviews, like, "Oh, Peña Nieto, how are you doing so well? And, tell us about your marriage to your former soap opera star," which they divorced the day after he left office. But he would never actually face the press. And AMLO, like him or not, is facing the press every morning. And that's a huge difference right there.
Yeah, that definitely shows some, bravery, and that he's very secure with what he's doing. One of the articles I found particularly interesting was the first 100 days. So you stated that the first term is basically defend him against attacks from the right while building a movement to push him from the left.
Right.
So that sounds American in some ways. It really does. So can you kind of just give an overview of what you mean by that?
Sure. So AMLO, not surprisingly, has been, under attack since he took office. And it's been coordinated attacks from, bots and the right-wing press. Mexico has 2 major television stations, Televisa and TV Azteca, and they're very much commercial television stations, and they do what the mainstream media does, like your Fox and your MSNBC and all of that. So, AMLO has faced this his entire career, So I think part of the strategy has been AMLO's own exposure in giving those daily press conferences and setting the agenda. He's like, I'm out there every morning and this is the agenda. I'm not going to passively sit back and be, victim of, they just make up, this bot universe. They just make up fake news constantly, and they make up fake news every day, and they throw it out there and they see what will stick, Shortly after AMLO took office, the governor of Puebla, who had just won a very controversial, very close election, died in a helicopter crash. So of course, the bot universe said AMLO did it. There was no proof. Of course, it wasn't true. But of course, this is the thing. It's constantly make up fake news, fake news, fake news, fake news, fake news, put it out there, and just think that just by force of accumulation, enough of these will stick to, over time, not immediately, discredit AMLO. So this is the constant thing. At AMLO's, when AMLO took office, he invited foreign heads of state, because that's what you do. You invite foreign heads of state. It's called diplomatic protocol. So of course he invited Nicolas Maduro. So when the names of the heads of state were, read out, the right-wing legislators fell over themselves and rolled around on the ground in the Congress because he'd invited Maduro when previous presidents had invited Maduro for the exact same reason, or Chavez. So it's just a constant barrage that we know very well, having to defend Bernie from constant bullshit attacks, and Jeremy Corbyn supporters in the UK, and on and on. So you have to have a very clever strategy of constant rapid response to go after all the bot shit, which happens here just as much. Now, that's on one hand. The thing that AMLO has to deal with beyond that is that international powers then come into play, right? Now, AMLO is a mild social democrat, but even that is too much for, Wall Street Journal, which has penned a series of kind of rabid anti-AMLO editorials, the Financial Times, all these people, and they're already, running the drumbeat. AMLO is authoritarian, as if Boris Johnson in the UK didn't just shut down Parliament. But if you're on the right, it's okay, you can shut down Parliament, right? But of course, they try to play this drumbeat that AMLO is this left-wing authoritarian, and they use the international media to do that. So that's another factor that Latin American governments always have to deal with. Then you have the example of the ratings agencies, Fitch and Moody's, who were totally, being paid by the Peña Nieto administration to keep their ratings high. As soon as AMLO comes into place, what do? They start lowering Mexico's bond ratings. Pemex, the Mexican oil company, they lower the bond ratings. Mexico's sovereign debt, they lower the bond ratings. Even though AMLO is basically following a very moderate macroeconomic strategy, no debts, basically no tax increases, moderate spending. Even that though, because he wants to rescue Mexico's oil industry, Pemex, and make it independent again. So boom, so what do you do as Mitch and Foodies? You lower the bond ratings so that Mexico has to pay higher interest rates on its debt. And so that's the way you can kind of slap governments down that dare to, just move an inch away from neoliberal orthodoxy in the Washington consensus, And that's a special difficulty that Latin American governments have. AMLO has done nothing to merit, finances are in very good shape under his government, merit, having the ratings be lowered. These are the same ratings agencies that, were giving A ratings to junk stuff before the 2008 crash, right? They're totally corrupt. But they're part of the American soft power to try to keep Latin American governments in line. And if your interest rates go up just a little bit, that's a lot more money you have to pay out in interest instead of helping the poor, social programs, education, infrastructure. You're paying it in debt. So he's got a lot on his plate in that sense. The other part of the question, I think, is what we have to do from the left to pull him. And that's to have a real organization from the left There are things that Amlo has done, that on the left, it's like, well, what do what's going on here? So you can't just give any leader a blank check. You have to be constantly organizing and mobilizing. And I think one example of that is what's going on in Chiapas, where the Zapatista communities are organizing against AMLO's proposal to put in a tourist train in the Yucatan Peninsula called the Maya train, and they want nothing of it. They're saying this is not sustainable local development. It's a tourist train to shuttle tourists around to ruins. We don't want that. So, you can't just give a blank check to anyone. No left movement ever should, because it's not about one person, right? It's not me, us, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, you bring up some really awesome points. One of the other things that you touched on in an article, it was called the Mexican and international right are united in their efforts to delegitimize the AMLO presidency. Again, comparable to what we're seeing here too. There's a lot of parallels. So can you kind of expand on that?
Well, yeah, definitely. One of the first major decisions AMLO had to take after taking power was whether or not to recognize Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela, the Trump puppet in Venezuela. And very bravely, AMLO said, we're not going there. We respect national sovereignty, and we respect, every government's right to choose their own leaders. And he came under heavy pressure from the U.S. Remember that AMLO is one of the few progressive governments now left in Latin America. The pink tide of the early 2000s has receded. Evo Morales continues in power. It looks like Macri is about to be thrown out in Argentina. Venezuela is on total lockdown because of the U.S. Embargo. So AMLO was pretty much out there alone in Latin America and did it and said, we're remaining neutral here and we're opening ourselves up to mediation. So boom, you get all of this international and U.S. pressure there. The Lima Group, which is this group formed by Canada with a lot of right-wing governments from Latin America, to try to pressure the line, and this is the way this works. You have to toe the line, or you'll face ostracism. You'll face your debt ratings going down. You'll have international media saying you're authoritarian. You'll have this whole campaign against you. And I think it's very clear that if Venezuela had gone down, the pressure would be on Mexico next. Look what happened in Brazil. I mean, Brazil, again, it was a mild social democratic government under Lula and under Dilma. Even that was too much for the powers that be. So they impeached Dilma. They threw Lula in prison. And now what you have is this, neo-fascist Bolsonaro. So that when you realize that international powers that be won't even accept, we're not even talking about communism here. We're talking about a mild social democratic government. They won't even accept that. They won't accept anyone who deviates an inch from their failed consensus that they have to impose. And if anyone does, then you're opening yourselves up to, hard coups are out of fashion nowadays because it's bad PR. Tanks in the streets are bad PR. Soldiers marching down the avenues are bad PR. So you do it through soft power. You encourage right-wing movements, right-wing cells. You encourage fake news. You encourage bots. You encourage this whole ecosystem on the web to try to build up discontent. Right now, the Mexican right wing is ridiculous and prostrate. But who knows if a Bolsonaro figure would come up here over the next few years. It's certainly not beyond the pale. You propitiate and provoke economic crisis if you can. You pull out money, you pull out currency. You can cause a currency devaluation. You can cause a run on the peso. you can create all kinds of hostile conditions for a progressive leader to have to deal with. The Financial Times, in one of its editorials in May, was very specific about this. It said, AMLO is authoritarian, so we only have two ways to rein AMLO in. One is the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the other is the international financial markets. And so basically, if you don't behave, nice peso there, you know, shame if something happened with it. You know, just total mafia tactics on the part of international currency markets. And you have to stand up to that. And this is a message that the US left has to learn too. You know, I remember when Bill Clinton was elected, I'm old enough, and in his first year, he wanted to enact some mild stimulus, very mild, right? And they said the same thing to Clinton. Oh, your bond ratings are going to go down, and this and that and that, and he backed off. Any left government anywhere has to have a structure and an organization that's sufficient to withstand the threats and the hostage taking by the international financial markets. That's something I think we have to take into account. If and when Bernie wins, it's not going to be a walk in the park, even though the US is a much stronger geopolitical power.
Have you spoken to anyone in Mexico who likes Bernie, doesn't like Bernie?
Yeah, people are following it. You know, Trump is universally loathed in Mexico to the extent that perhaps no other country can match. I think, you know, 98% of Mexico loathes Trump, and the other 2%, you know, on life support. No, won't find a Trump supporter here. I mean, for the, you know, the rampant racism and the xenophobia, and we could, you know, go on and on. People are paying attention, and there is a lot of interest for Bernie. I think the problem is, and this is it's America's own fault. No American politician, to an extent, is trusted down here because both parties, throughout history, have always behaved towards Mexico in a very imperialistic manner in all of Latin America, either a Republican or a Democrat. You know, with few exceptions, a little bit of FDR, you know, a little bit of good neighbor in there. But by and large, you know, from a Mexican point of view, there's very little difference in foreign policy between the Republican and Democratic administrations. So, you know, Bernie's anti-imperialistic message and cut the military, no more intervening, resonates. But still, Bernie is still calling Maduro a dictator. You know, he's still not speaking out on the embargo against Venezuela. You know, there are things that we have to be pushing Bernie on as well. And, you know, nobody has to love Maduro or anybody else. But there's this such an in-baked imperialism in the United States. I mean, it's just so built in that, you know, American politicians, even with Bernie, is going to have to go a long way to gain trust.
Yeah, absolutely. So being that you are so knowledgeable with things like this, what is your overall take on Tulsi and her foreign policy?
You know, I think in general, I really appreciate, you know, Tulsi. You know, I'm not an expert on Tulsi Gabbard, but I really appreciate what she did in 2016, which is sticking her neck out for Bernie and resigning from the DNC. And I think that's very important. And I think we always have to be on the left building coalitions. And, you know, I think you said it in your tweets, and not getting involved in fights with Tulsi supporters or things of that nature. And I like a lot of what she has to say about non-interventionism. I think she's got some questionable ties with certain, you know, or, you know, she's made some questionable statements on leaders like India's leader, Syria's leader, etc. But I think in general, she's a strong anti-interventionist voice, and I think that's something to take very heavily into account. You know, Tulsi was there in 2016 when Warren wasn't. You know, that's very, very important. You know, and I think, you know, there are very few anti-interventionist voices in American politics. Very, very few. The Green Party has been excellent on this, but because of the way the American political system works, you know, the Green Party doesn't get media coverage and airtime. So Tulsi is not perfect, but she's one of the few anti-interventionist voices, you know, Gravel, of course, but one of the few prominent anti-interventionist voices being heard in American politics, and that's very important. It's not like there are many of them, you know. That's
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What is, when you speak to people in Mexico, in your neighborhood or where have you,
Yeah.
what is one of their, what are their concerns? Is it medical care? Is it poverty? Is it, pricing of apartments, housing? What seem to be the things that people worry about the most?
The big issue, certainly in the 2018 campaign, was corruption. And Enrique Peña Nieto was basically turning Mexico into a kleptocratic state. That was just a huge, huge issue. And some of AMLO's early moves, his attorney general is going after some of the people involved in that corruption. So we're starting to see some arrests down here. Emilio Lozoya, who is the head of Pemex, and he was instrumental in helping fund Enrique Peña Nieto's 2012 campaign with foreign dirty money. For example, from the Brazilian company Odebrecht, which has caused scandals in basically every Latin American country. Rosario Robles, who was the development secretary, who was laundering money through universities, through the social development budget to contractors and such, to the tune of billions of pesos. She's now in prison awaiting trial. So that was a big this thing with when Obama took office, and we're like, is he going to jail the bankers? Are we going to see prosecutions? And we didn't. And that was a huge thing that undercut support for Obama, right? There weren't prosecutions. So that was a similar thing for AMLO. Are there going to be prosecutions against everybody who robbed and stole the Mexican people blind under the last administration? And there have been some. People want to go after the former president himself, Peña Nieto. That's going to be harder. AMLO's been a lot more reticent about that. He's trying to kind of, let's just get the transition going. Let's not, topple ex-presidents. So he belongs in jail. Felipe Calderon, the president before him, belongs in jail. Those are the bigger ducks up there. So I think that was a big thing, was corruption. The other big thing is poverty. Like I said before, Mexico has 60 million people in poverty in a country of 130 million people. The minimum wage is $5 a day. AMLO did raise the minimum wage. One of his first things he did when taking office, so it's a little bit more, but it's still it's a starvation.
Per day.
It's per day, right? A day, So
how much is an average apartment?
Well, somebody earning the minimum wage could never afford an apartment. They'd be living with their family. They'd be living with their family. They'd be living, in these outskirts of these cities, in basically, shanty houses or favela kind of housing. If you're paying the minimum wage, you can't afford an apartment. This has been the scandal of Mexico for a long time. The Mexican Constitution, it's a constitutional provision that requires the minimum wage to be sufficient to support a family. And like the American minimum wage, although much more drastically, it just never has gone up. So over the years, it's been eroded and eroded. Then there was a peso crisis in 1982. There was another peso crisis in 1994. And the minimum wage came out of it, ridiculous, just a joke. So AMLO raised it, and it got raised particularly in the northern border area, which set off some interesting strike activity in the Maquiladora area of Matamoros in the first months of the year, which is very, for those of us on the left, it's very inspiring to see some very serious strike activity going on in the Maquiladoras, the 2032 movements, which, has won some victories and also lost some. So that's another big thing on people's minds. And the third thing is security. There's been, since Felipe Calderon took office fraudulently in 2006, he set off this war on drugs, this Reagan-inspired war on drugs, which basically was a way to install himself in power because he hadn't won legitimately. So he's, I'm going to be the big tough guy president. I'm going to send the military out in the streets. And we're going to have this terribly violent, supposed war on drugs, which is really a way to suppress the country, suppress social movements, have an excuse to have the military out in the streets, which, right-wing autocrats get a hard-on about having the military out in the streets. So this idea of drugs is a great pretext to militarize the country. Over 200,000 people have died over the course of the last 2 administrations in this war on drugs, fed with American arms, fed with American military aid through the Marry the Plan, American military weaponry, training, all of this coming from the US government, plus the entire clandestine trafficking in guns, which I wrote about in my most recent Jacobin piece. Trump complains about immigrants going north. Mexico should be complaining a lot more about guns coming south. Mexico has very strict gun control laws that are totally undermined by the fact that anybody can, go to the United States, buy guns at a gun show, no check, buy guns in the black market, go into Walmart, buy guns and bring them back. So the cartels and the police and everybody are being funded. It's mostly American weapons being used for people to kill each other here. And that's on us. That's on us. That's on our gun industry. Many of whom wouldn't be in business without the clandestine weapons business of selling, guns, smuggling guns down to Mexico. So security is a huge thing for people as well. And Amlo is in a tough position because, violence hasn't gone down yet. He's setting up a National Guard, but the National Guard has military in it. So he's continuing to an extent the militarization of the country that happened under the last 2 governments, because things are to an extent now that he feels that the police are too corrupted to do it themselves. So he's in a difficult position, and that, I think, is an example of once the military is out in the street, it's very hard to pull them back in. Once the genie is out of the bottle, even a progressive.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
And it's kind of daunting because it does kind of give you a glimpse into, should we be lucky enough to have President Bernie, we are going to be facing the same, obstacles. Speaking on guns, you did recently write an article on one of the shootings in Texas. Do you want to kind of, give a synopsis of that and what your passion was in going into writing it?
Yeah. So, as we know, the El Paso shooting was an open attack against the Hispanic community. It was an open attack against the Hispanic community, mostly Mexican, and that is just riffing off of Trump's anti-Mexican rhetoric for years. Mexicans are rapists, Mexicans are violent, Mexicans or whatever else, When you look at the violence committed around the world and you look at the violence committed in the United States, no, it's white male Americans that are violent, not Mexicans. But Trump was on this drumbeat, this racist drumbeat for years. And it was only then a question of time before someone would take Trump at his word and go down and try to shoot Mexicans. And that's what happened here, this Patrick Croises, whatever you call it. He, got in his car, drove 9 hours to El Paso, to this Walmart, which is kind of a meeting place where a lot of people cross the border to go to Walmart, a lot of the Mexican-American community. It's one of the most heavily used Walmarts in the country, and inspired by that Trump racist language, which no Republican has tried to stop, to stand up and say, have you no decency? Very few Democrats as well, not enough, because everybody's been so stuck in Russia paranoia, that they're not even haven't noticed for years what's going on right, under their noses enough. So he, inspired by Trump, opened fire and killed mostly either Mexicans or Mexican Americans. It was an open attack against the Mexican community. And I think AMLO's response to that was a very good one. He said, this is terrorism, Mexico's president. He said, this is terrorism. This is a terrorist act. We want to extradite him and let him face justice in Mexico. Now, America's never going to extradite this guy.
That would be awesome, though.
It would be awesome.
That would be
awesome. Let him sit in a Mexican prison. But I think the important thing here, and I think I wrote about this in one of the Jacobin pieces, we on the left have always tried to promote this idea of, as socialists, of thinking beyond this idea of nation states, not being limited by the idea of the nation state, but thinking of an international working class, right? And there's no better example of an international working class than the Mexican example, where you have 130 million Mexicans here, 12 million Mexicans in the States as immigrants, and then second and third generations, 30 million more Mexican Americans. So you've got an international working class, cross-border, basically supporting American capitalism, in the lowest rung of the economic ladder, and supporting Mexican capitalism in the lowest rung of the economic ladder here. So the opportunities for international cooperation, and we've seen some of that with the strikes among the Hispanic workers going back to 2006 and since, the possibilities of this are incredible. And we're very much hoping that the Hispanic community becomes very, 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 very active this time around in this election. So I think it's important that, a Mexican president, looking at an attack that took place on American soil, said this was an attack against our people, even though it took place in Texas, and we want him to be extradited. He won't be, but the symbolic element of that is very important. And, cut the racism, cut the shit, or this is going to keep happening.
Absolutely. One of the things that I know, even as a white person, is freaking just infuriating and so abhorrent, is when stuff like that happens, there's always one or two newspapers who say, they don't put in the words hate crime. It's a hate crime.
It's a hate crime.
It's not a shooting. It's a hate crime. So how is that, being in the country who's being vilified, and having those things like that just completely negated?
It's hard. You're right. It's a hate crime, and it should be treated as a federal hate crime offense. I think it's hard for people to realize what people go through to get to the U.S. The way American Border Patrol have set it up now, they've basically set it up so they're basically channeling people, immigrants, through the Sonora Desert and through the desert on the Arizona side. They basically use that as a geographical weapon against immigrants. It's not, you cross the border and there you are. Most of them are crossing the border and then going through days and days of desert, and a lot of them are dying along the way. It's an incredible, untold human tragedy of entire families dying in the desert, and just having their bleached bones found months and years later. And of course, all the rhetoric is, well, then stay in your own country. Well, then, how about the United States stop intervening in Latin America? How about we stop supporting coups, both parties? How about, does anybody know how many times America has intervened in Mexico? I mean, it's just, they've intervened time after time over the intervened in the Mexican Revolution. They stole half of Mexico in the 19th century. I mean, this is just in 2009, Obama green-lighted a coup in Honduras.
Yeah.
Zelaya. And I said, oh, we didn't do it. It would never have happened without Obama and Clinton's, green light. It never would have happened. The whole Reagan administration shredding of Central America in the 80s, Guatemala, which America had staged a coup in 1954, which led to a civil war that lasted 30 years. Imagine having your country devastated in a 30-year civil war. Honduras, as we just talked about. Honduras was used as a staging point for the Contras to invade Nicaragua and the Sandinista government throughout the 80s. In 1989, George Bush Sr. invaded Panama to get out Noriega and destroyed the working class section of Panama City. So it goes on and on and on and on. So the appalling ignorance of how we've set this up so that people have no choice but to immigrate is staggering. Add to that now climate change issues. There have been some, I have to admit it, I think it was the New York Times, they've had some good pieces on how climate change now is affecting things to the point in Guatemala where agriculture isn't working where it used to. There are places where now people are climate, like in Syria, right? There are now climate refugees. So it's destabilization refugees added to the climate. I think it was The Guardian, sorry, it wasn't the New York Times. So add destabilization, add endemic poverty, and add now climate. And that's only going to get worse all over the world. And you're going to have more and more of these refugee flows. Kind of a long question.
No, that you're totally right. And, it's very frustrating to see white people say, well, you know what, they should stay there. Listen, assholes, if they are literally risking death to walk bajillions of miles with their family, it's bad. So my heart goes out to anyone who even tries that, because that's heartbreaking. And you're right. Maybe we should stop intervening, and then people won't need to leave their places all the time. It's so disheartening. What, as far as Amlo, what is his stance on climate change? Was that a prevalent part in his campaign, or is it more kind of foreign issues he deals with?
It wasn't a big part of the campaign, unfortunately. None of the major candidates here in the election talked a lot about it. It's just not as much on the political radar here, unfortunately. Amlo has taken some mild steps toward addressing climate change. He's starting a reforestation program in the south of Mexico, but he's saying these are trees that would be also good for wood. So, if they're being cut down for wood, then it's not really a climate program, is it?
Yeah.
It's just, unfortunately, climate change is not on the political radar here as much as it should be, because Mexico stands to really lose a lot from climate change. Mexico is suffering severe water shortages all over the country. The city I live in, Oaxaca, is chronically without water. So you see people downtown having to buy water from water trucks constantly. So you see these water trucks on the street pumping water into houses because there's just not enough city water or not enough, other means of water. And that's only going to get worse. Mexico City has got a severe water problem. It's one of those day zero cities. It's on there up with Sao Paulo and these cities where they're in a risk of running out of water. And that just wasn't mentioned enough here. It wasn't. It wasn't. And it's to a certain extent that makes sense, right? America and the first world countries produce much more in the way of international emissions. And of course, this wealthy strata of people in the world produce much more of international emissions, right? The US military alone, this wealthy elite, this 100 companies who are responsible for a huge amount of the fossil fuel emissions. I think over the years, there's been this sense by third world countries, or what are called third world countries, that the first world countries have got to take the lead on this because they've historically produced much more of the emissions and they have economically benefited a lot more from it. So they've got to take the lead. And it's funny that when Amazon is burning and the G7 came up with like $20 million for the Amazon, it's like, oh, thanks. Thanks for $20 million. That's really cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
None of this, is to absolve AMLO or anyone else from the responsibility to fight climate change. The problem is Mexico is really over a barrel because Mexico depends on oil production to fund its economy. Mexico's economy can't run without oil production. And AMLO's big thing was we need to pump more oil. We need to pump more oil, basically, to pay for the social programs. AMLO has instituted a universal pension, a modest but important universal pension for over 65s, a scholarship program for students who are studying in high school and universities, a scholarship apprentice program for what's called ninis in Mexico, which are people who neither study nor work, kind of real recruitment group for organized crime and the drug cartels, infrastructure spending, and a lot of other things. Mexico needs to produce oil. So while in the U.S., the argument is, importantly, keep it in the ground, we have a progressive government in Mexico producing more oil. Now he says, I don't want to overproduce, but we do need to produce more. And it's hard as a center-left government working within a capitalist system to not produce more oil if you're Mexico. So it's hard because that's totally anti-climate change, producing more oil. But how do you tell Mexico don't produce more oil? What are they,
right.
what are they supposed to do?
Right. Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Lance, who's a team member, says, how is the relationship with EZLN and Amlo admin?
That's an excellent question. Actually, we've got a piece coming out in The Nation on Monday that will try to answer exactly that. But just to kind of advance an answer, it's very tense. It's not good. The relationship between AMLO and the Zapatista movement has never been a good one. And this goes back to the 90s when AMLO was in the PRD and then when he was running for president in the early 2000s. And he had people on his team who'd been involved in previous governments that had been, repressing the Zapatista movement during its time of peak uprising in the 90s. So from then, the relationship between AMLO and the EZLN was not good. And it's never gotten better. Subcomandante Galeano, formerly Marcos now Galeano, and a lot of Zapatistas see AMLO as just another brick in the wall, basically, another capitalist, that even though he's committed to social reforms and, social democracy, still is functioning within the capitalist system and wants to develop southern Mexico along a capitalist model, state capitalism, but still capitalism. So we talked about the Maya train. AMLO wants to set up these free trade zones in the port of Salina Cruz, in Oaxaca, and Coatzacoalcos, in Veracruz. He wants to build this free trade corridor linking the Pacific to the Atlantic as a substitute to the Panama Canal, and put in factories in there and maquiladoras. And the Zapatista community rightly looks at all that and says, what's that going to bring? More maquiladoras, more free trade zones where these corporations are not going to pay taxes, because that's what they are. They're basically like these enterprise zones that the Republicans tried to put in the 80s and 90s in the US cities, these kind of tax havens to try to get corporations to go into inner cities. So you get corporations coming in federal zones, so state labor laws won't apply. Low-wage labor, low-wage factory labor, trying to industrialize this corridor between the Pacific and the Atlantic, which conveniently will also be used as a way to stop immigrants. AMLO is trying to keep immigrants basically following the Trump diktat in southern Mexico. So it's like, keep them there, keep them building the Maya train, keep them planting trees. And it's wonderful that he wants to give jobs to Central American migrants. But it's not wonderful that he's doing it because Trump says, we don't want your migrants, you be our southern border, which is basically what Mexico has become. Their southern border. They sent 6,000 troops from the National Guard down. So the Zapatista movement looks at all that, the Maya train, these free trade zones, the factories that are going in, the National Guard going down to militarize the border with Guatemala. The Mexican military has been known for terrible human rights abuses over the years. And just because they have a different name, the National Guard, doesn't mean that they're just automatically now going to not do that. There's also paramilitary activity going on still in areas in Chiapas that the federal government hasn't yet been able to get a hold on, land disputes and territory disputes and such. So the short answer is that the EZLN looks with extreme skepticism at AMLO. And a lot of times kind of the Mexican parliamentary left looks askance at Zapatismo, saying, well, if we're not in Chiapas, if we're not Zapatistas, what are we supposed to do? So there's a lot of misunderstanding between, I guess, what you'd call the parliamentary left and the anti-capitalist autonomous left. They don't communicate, they're not communicating very well. They're two different, absolutely different worldviews, and economic views and cultural views and cosmovisions. Mexico is a very complicated place. It's got, in the state of Oaxaca alone, where I live, 16 different indigenous languages are spoken, and Chiapas all the more. There's, a huge diversity of language, of culture, of political organization. There are a lot of communities in the south of Mexico that don't have political parties. They don't believe in political parties. They don't believe in adversarial politics. They say that political parties tear their communities apart, and they ram the political parties out, and they operate under basically a town meeting system or usos y costumbres system, a consensual system, an autonomous system. So it's not just a question of having a different, what do you think about this view or that view or this issue or that issue? They have absolutely different ways of conceiving life. And that's hard to put together.
Wow. Yeah, that's really incredible. So we touched on a lot. I feel like we could probably talk for like 5 more hours, but I definitely want to have you back again, because this is really good for people to hear. So what is something you would like to leave the audience with as a takeaway, just for them to take with them and research more or share with their friends?
Well, I just like to make a simple point. I know this is probably a pretty progressive audience listening to this program, so it's probably not something I have to say, but just to point out that, Mexico is an extraordinary culture, of extraordinary people, extraordinary culture, art, literature, you name it. And I think we don't know enough about Mexico, because we're not taught in schools, because our schools are shit, because, there's a language barrier, and because we're busy and we're ground to the bone under capitalism. Find out more about Mexico. It's not just Cancun and beaches. I mean, it's an extraordinary millennial culture. In a sense, kind of the fact that so many people are so ignorant of Mexico and kind of keeps people away who might, not appreciate it. But it's a culture that's really suffering. Just look at American and Canadian mining interests. This country is carved up for mining interests, and there's now more mineral extraction going on now in Mexico than happened in the colonial era, than happened in the epoch of the conquest. More gold, more silver, more precious minerals are being shipped out now than then. So how can we help support the Mexican working class, which is here and is also in the U.S.? How can we be in solidarity with, our Mexican brothers and sisters who are struggling here and struggling there, and want and need our support, and trade unions in the fight for 15, which are largely Hispanic workers, and a lot of these struggles that are going on daily, and anti-racism movements that are going on across the country. How can we be in solidarity? I think that's maybe the question we can leave with for today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Kurt. Give your websites and Twitter and all that fun stuff.
So Facebook, I'm Kurt William Hackbarth. Twitter, it's Kurt Hackbarth, at Kurt Hackbarth. So follow me, and I'll follow you back. And I've got some stuff coming out in Jacobin, coming out with a piece in The Nation that I said on Monday about Chiapas, to give kind of a more in-depth answer on that, and a lot of Bernie stuff. So hope to be in touch with people.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'm serious, I definitely want to ask you back sometime so we can go even more in depth. You're amazing, Kurt. Thank you so much. It's been amazing having you here. Take care and best of luck with everything.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for watching. Much love.